It came out of the dark with wings too wide for the alleys of a town this small. Its skin was gray, its body enormous, and from the center of its forehead came a blinding beam of light. Guns didn't stop it. Windows shattered in its wake. Some said it was part man. Others said it was part demon. But when it vanished into the mine shaft, even the bravest men refused to follow. And they never opened that mine again. In 1903, in the quiet town of Van Meter, Iowa, something strange happened. Over the course of 5 nights, respected townspeople, doctors, bankers, merchants, all claimed to see the same thing. A winged creature, glowing, massive, immune to bullets. Some believed it came from the mines. Others believed it came from somewhere else entirely. But whatever it was, it came, it terrified, and it disappeared, leaving behind only questions. I'm your host, Robert Barber. Today, we head to a forgotten mining town at the turn of the century, where a string of strange sightings brought fear, gunfire, and legend. This is the story of the Van Meter Visitor. This is State of the Unknown. Van Meter, Iowa was the kind of place where people left their front doors unlocked, not because they were careless, but because there had never been a reason not to. It was the fall of 1903, the kind of late September where the air smelled like wood smoke and dried corn husks, and the golden prairie light stretched the shadows long by late afternoon. The streets of Van Meter were narrow, packed with dirt and scattered pebbles. Brick buildings lined the main road, weather-worn and sun-bleached, their signs hand-painted and creaking gently in the breeze. Awnings stretched over wooden sidewalks where children dashed barefoot between barrels and crates, chasing each other with broomsticks and laughter. Their footsteps echoed between storefronts like the rhythm of a place still untouched by urgency. Gas lamps stood tall at the corners, casting flickering amber halos as the daylight faded. Their hiss was part of the nightly soundtrack, along with the clatter of wagon wheels over cobblestone, the whinny of tired horses, and the rustling of drying cornfields beyond the last row of homes. Van Meter was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, by name, by church pew, and by handshake. You could recognize your neighbor just by their silhouette, or by the sound of their boots on the general store's porch. The pace was slow, the customs were familiar, and the outside world felt very far away. It was a place where people rose with the sun, ended their days with pie, and didn't fear what they couldn't name, until something arrived that had no name. Van Meter sat like a postage stamp on the edge of the Iowa prairie. Endless cornfields ringed the town, fields so tall they swallowed the horizon by midsummer. But this wasn't just a farming town anymore. A coal mine had opened a few years earlier on the western edge of town, bringing jobs, dust, and a faint, ever-present smell of sulfur and ash. By 1903, the mine had closed down, but its presence still lingered. The mine entrance was sealed now, its timbers rotting and slumped in the damp earth. Abandoned ore carts sat rusted on their rails, half swallowed by weeds. Children dared each other to get close to it after school, but even then, there were stories. Don't go near the mine at night. Don't listen if you hear something breathing in the dark. Most laughed it off, but some didn't. At night, the town fell quiet. No electricity, no radios. Just the pop of gas lamps, the distant creak of wood siding settling in the breeze, and the occasional call of a night bird too far away to see. The people of Van Meter weren't used to the unknown. They were used to patterns, simplicity, routines that felt like scripture. So when something changed, when a strange light appeared in the sky above the rooftops, they noticed. And when something moved, too big to be a man, too wrong to be a bird, they knew. This wasn't just a passing shadow or a trick of the moon. This was something else, something no one had a word for, and it would only get stranger. The first sighting came just after midnight on September 29, 1903. U.G. Griffith, a well-known and respected businessman in town, was walking down Main Street, making his way home after a late meeting. The gas lamps hissed around him, casting soft golden puddles of light between deep shadows. His boots thudded against the packed dirt road, the only sound besides the distant chirps of crickets. But then, something made him stop. There, above one of the buildings, hovering in the darkness, was a blinding light. Not a lantern, not a reflection. It was too bright and too steady, focused, controlled. It seemed to scan the street below, sweeping back and forth like it was searching for something. Griffith squinted, shielding his eyes. He took a step closer, trying to make out what it was behind the glow. And just then, the light blinked off. What emerged from the darkness was a shape that froze him in place. It was massive, winged, and completely unnatural. Its wingspan stretched across the rooftop, silhouetted against the moonlight. It moved with too much weight to be a bird and too much grace to be a man. Griffith's throat closed. He turned and ran. The next day, he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. He told only a few people, quietly, cautiously. This was a town where reputations mattered. But later that same night, someone else would see it too. And this time, things escalated. Peter Dunn, the town banker, was known for being level-headed and practical. He was also not the type to go looking for trouble. But on the evening of September 30th, he heard something outside the back of the bank, a strange scraping noise near the alley wall. At first, he thought it was a thief, maybe a stray dog nosing through the trash. He grabbed his shotgun, stepped into the cool night air, and froze. What he saw next would change the story forever. There, crouched near the brick wall, was a creature. It stood at least 8 feet tall. Its skin looked gray and leathery, almost reptilian in the gaslight. And rising from its forehead, a kind of horn or projection. From the tip of that horn came a beam of light, not flickering, not wavering, like a spotlight. It cut across the alley with surgical precision, illuminating every crack in the bricks. Dunn's instinct kicked in. He raised his shotgun and fired, once and then again. The blast echoed off the alley walls. Windows rattled. But the creature didn't flinch, didn't cry out, didn't fall. Instead, it spread enormous bat-like wings, launched into the air with impossible grace, and disappeared over the rooftops. By morning, the town was buzzing, not just because of what Dunn had seen, but because of what had been left behind. In the soft dirt behind the bank were giant 3-toed footprints, each one nearly a foot long, sunken deep into the earth, too large to be human, too unnatural for any local wildlife. They were like something from a storybook or a nightmare. Now the town had proof, not just a light in the sky, not just a frightened businessman, but a respected figure, a banker, who had fired his weapon point blank, and something survived. That was the moment the fear began to spread. That was when the people of Van Meter realized this wasn't going away. And it was only the beginning. The next few nights in Van Meter were anything but peaceful. What started as isolated encounters began to feel like a pattern, and what had been dismissed as overactive imagination became a nightly threat. The creature didn't stay hidden. It moved through town like it was surveying the buildings, studying the people, as if it were searching for something or someone. Sidney Gregg, a local merchant, claimed he saw the thing as he left his store late one night. He was locking up when he heard a loud flapping, then a thud. He turned and saw a creature as tall as a man, crouched on the rooftop across the street. Before he could react, it leapt, not gliding, not fluttering, but soaring in a way that defied its size, straight across the street and onto another rooftop. It landed with a crunch that shook the shingles and sent a few sliding to the ground. Greg backed through his doorway and locked it behind him. He didn't open that door again until daylight. Around town, rumors spread faster than newspapers. Children were kept home from school. Men lingered longer at the general store, hushed and wide-eyed. Doors were bolted, shutters nailed shut, lanterns left burning longer in the night than usual, just in case. And still, the creature kept coming. On the third night, Dr. Alcott, the town physician, was awakened by an eerie light outside his second-story window. At first, he thought it was a prowler. He grabbed his revolver and stepped outside. He didn't expect to see the creature perched on a telephone pole, its horned head slowly rotating, scanning the street below with its brilliant beam of light. It didn't move like an animal. It turned deliberately, methodically, like it was studying something. Startled, Alcott fired his gun. The shot hit, he was sure of it, but once again, nothing happened. The creature spread its leathery wings and glided off into the darkness, leaving behind that same musky, sulfuric stench. By the fourth night, Van Meter had armed itself. This wasn't a town of cowards, but people were afraid. They weren't dealing with a burglar. They weren't dealing with a bear. They were dealing with something that didn't make sense, and that was somehow worse. Groups of men began patrolling in shifts, shotguns, lanterns, pitchforks, hunting rifles. Each man had a weapon and a story, because by now, nearly everyone had seen something. One group chased the creature through alleys and across the schoolyard. They fired when they could. It never bled. It never even faltered. And then it disappeared again, back into the night sky like smoke slipping through a crack. But it didn't leave behind just silence. It left behind a smell, that same sulfurous odor. A few said it made them dizzy. Others swore it lingered on their clothes for days. Whatever it wasn't natural. Something was moving through the streets of Van Meter, and the town wasn't sleeping anymore. For 4 nights, fear grew, and yet the creature wasn't finished. Because on the 5th night, it would return to where it began, the mine. By the 4th night, Van Meter wasn't just on edge. It was changing. The fear had settled deep into the cracks of everyday life. You could see it in the way people spoke, in how they walked, how they watched the skies. What had once been a town of routine and quiet evenings became a place of locked doors, shuttered windows, and early nightfall. Children whispered about monsters in the trees. Mothers clutched rosaries and hung them above the windowsills. Fathers kept loaded shotguns propped behind the front door, just in case. The general store started closing before dusk. School attendance dropped. Even church felt quieter. That Sunday, pews sat half empty, not because faith had weakened, but because people were too afraid to leave their homes after dark. Neighbors who once waved over white picket fences now avoided eye contact, because in a town this small, if you'd seen something, chances were your neighbor had too, and neither of you wanted to say it out loud. Some claimed they saw the creature from attic windows, crouched on rooftops, or darting across the misty fields. Others didn't see anything at all, but they heard the leathery flapping, felt their home shudder, and smelled the sulfur that seemed to seep through the walls. The smell, they said, was the worst of it. It came before the silence, thick and chemical, like burning matches and rotten eggs. So strong it stuck to your clothes, so foul it made the dogs bark for hours. Some swore the creature left it behind on purpose, as a warning or a claim. What had begun as a strange encounter had now taken root as a communal terror. Something was stalking Van Meter, and no one could stop it. But even in fear, there's a breaking point. And for the men of Van Meter, that moment came when the sightings began drifting towards the mine, that sealed-up shaft at the edge of town, the one most folks passed without a second thought. Now it felt like something else, not abandoned, but waiting. And it was there, on the fifth and final night, that everything came to a head. By the fifth night, Van Meter was wide awake. No one was sleeping. Lanterns burned in windows like watchful eyes. Fathers sat in rocking chairs on front porches with rifles across their laps. Children were hushed and sent to bed early, not because they were misbehaving, but because their parents didn't know what else to do. The town was tired, nervous, and ready. Because if the thing came back, it wouldn't be met with whispers anymore. It would be met with gunfire. The western edge of Van Meter had always felt a little out of bounds, past the last homes in the churchyard, past the fields and the tree line. There sat the abandoned coal mine, once a source of promise, now a boarded-up mouth in the earth, sealed and silent. No one had gone near it in years. Children made up ghost stories about it. Teenagers dared each other to get close on summer nights. But everyone, deep down, knew the same truth. There was something off about that place. That's why, when the creature was spotted heading toward the mine, several armed men followed. It was just after midnight. 5 townsmen stood at a distance, watching the trees bend in the wind, waiting for movement, listening. And then they saw it, hovering near the old mine entrance. Its horn glowing, its wings outstretched, was the creature. Even from a distance, they said it was enormous, its skin gray, leathery, glinting in the moonlight. It moved like it had been here before, like it belonged to this place. One of the men whispered a prayer, another raised his rifle, but none of them fired, because in that moment they saw something else, a second figure. Smaller, but similar. It emerged from the shadows near the mine's mouth, standing just behind the larger creature. The same skin, the same wings, the same glowing horn. Whether it was a mate, offspring, or something entirely different, no one could say. But it was enough. The 2 creatures turned toward the mine, and slowly they descended into it. Not flying, not leaping, but walking, like they'd done it before. Into the mine, into the dark, and then they were gone. The next morning, the men returned, this time with tools. They didn't wait, they didn't hesitate. They brought bricks, mortar, lumber, hammer and nails. They sealed the mine entrance permanently. Not a warning, a lock. Some say they heard strange noises from inside while they worked. Faint echoes, shuffling sounds, maybe even breathing. Others say they didn't want to know. They bricked it shut, they turned away, and they never opened it again. The mine is still there, still sealed, now hidden by vines, overgrowth, and time. In total, the sightings lasted 5 nights, from September 29th to October 3rd, 1903. There were no photographs, no bodies, no feathers, no broken horn. Just a trail of footprints, shattered windows, a few empty shotgun shells, and a story that the people of Van Meter would never forget. The thing that stalked their rooftops, glowed in the dark, and shrugged off bullets never came back. But it never really left either. Not from their minds, not from their history, not from the edge of town where the trees still bend in strange ways, and the air sometimes carries that same faint sulfur smell. Something happened in Van Meter, and it ended at the mine. Or maybe it just went deeper. So what exactly was the Van Meter visitor? A bird? A monster? A hoax? Something from another dimension? Over the last 120 years, people have tried to answer that question. They've brought binoculars and EMF detectors, pitched theories in newspapers and at paranormal conferences. But the truth is, the story still doesn't make sense. Because this just wasn't one man's hallucination. This was dozens of witnesses across multiple nights. Many of them respected leaders in the community. Their stories matched, their fear was real, and the footprints were measured. Whatever happened, it left a mark. The most common skeptical explanation is that the visitor was simply a large bird, perhaps a barn owl or even a great blue heron, startled into flight. Birds of prey can be surprisingly large. A great horned owl has piercing eyes that reflect light, can fly silently, and may look terrifying in the dark. And in 1903, most townspeople didn't have access to field guides or zoological knowledge. They relied on what they knew, and no one in Van Meter had seen anything like this. But here's the problem with that bird theory. No bird in Iowa has ever been recorded as having a horn that emits light. No owl leaves three-toed footprints measuring a foot across. And no bird, certainly not one startled by humans, takes multiple shotgun blasts without flinching. There were no feathers left behind, no roosts, no natural explanation for the sulfuric odor. So if it was a bird, it was one that we've never cataloged, and that's a mystery in and of itself. Another theory is mass hysteria. One respected man sees something strange. He tells a friend. The story spreads, and suddenly people start seeing it everywhere. Their mind fills in the blanks. Fear sharpens shadows. A hoot in the distance becomes a screech. The wind on the roof becomes wings. And sure, this has happened before. Mass panic is real, especially in small towns where one event can ripple fast. But Van Meter is different, because the accounts weren't secondhand rumors. They were firsthand, specific, and remarkably consistent. These were men like Dr. Alcott, the town physician, Peter Dunn, the bank manager, U.G. Griffith, a prominent businessman, O.V. White, a city councilman, and Sidney Gregg, the owner of a general store. These weren't thrill seekers or storytellers. They were the backbone of the community, with reputations to protect and no reason to lie. Some didn't even want to talk about it until they realized they weren't alone. And here's the final problem with the hysteria theory. Hysteria doesn't leave footprints. It doesn't shatter windows, and it certainly doesn't descend into a mine. The third theory ventures beyond biology and into the paranormal. Some believe the Van Meter visitor was not a creature at all, but a supernatural being, or even more strangely, an ultra-terrestrial. Ultra-terrestrials aren't aliens from outer space. They're theorized entities from alternate dimensions, beings that can enter our world briefly, often at sites of spiritual, magnetic, or geological significance. This theory points to several oddities: the beam of light emitted from the creature's forehead, its invulnerability to bullets, the sulfuric stench long associated with paranormal encounters, its deliberate movement and appearance at a sealed mine, often seen in folklore as a symbolic underworld or liminal space. The idea is that Van Meter, particularly the mine, may be what some call a thin place, a spot where the boundaries between realities grow thin, where something from another layer of existence can bleed into ours, and maybe, just for a moment, walk among us. To many paranormal researchers, that's the simplest explanation. The visitor came through and went back. And then there's the theory that isn't about what the visitor was, but what it represented. The archetype theory. That this wasn't a flesh and blood being, but an ancient shape pulled from the deepest wells of human memory, a winged omen born from collective fear and intuition. We've seen these shapes before, the Mothman of Point Pleasant, the Thunderbirds in Native American traditions, bats, demons, and sky spirits from ancient Mesopotamia, the Garuda, and even biblical Nephilim. Winged creatures are seen as messengers, watchers, warnings. They appear before disaster or when something is changing. In this reading, the visitor was less a creature and more a reflection of what the town feared, of what it didn't understand, of how we process the unexplainable. It came to Van Meter not to harm, but to remind that even in a civilized world, with doctors and newspapers and polite society, there are still shadows we don't control, and sometimes they flap their wings. So what was it? A hoax? A bird? A being from another world? Or a mirror held up to our own fear of the unknown? We still don't know, but maybe the not knowing is what gives the story power, because it didn't end with a body in the street, or a lab report, or a scientific explanation. It ended with silence in a sealed mind. And sometimes that's worse. The story of the Van Meter visitor didn't die in 1903. It faded, like all strange things do, first from the headlines and then from the conversations. But it never really disappeared, because the people who saw it never forgot. They carried the story in letters, in hushed recollections passed between generations, in the way some families never quite walked near the old mine again, and we know their names. The surviving documents, most notably a 1937 article by Clarence J. Lambert and several contemporary newspaper reports, preserve a remarkable truth. The people who witnessed the visitor weren't cranks. They were men of business, men of medicine, men elected to public office. U.G. Griffith, the first man to see the glowing light above the rooftops. Peter Dunn, the bank manager who fired his shotgun at point-blank range. Dr. Alcott, the town's physician who shot the creature from his porch. Sidney Gregg, a shopkeeper who saw it leap across rooftops. O.V. White, a city councilman who gave one of the most detailed sightings. And a posse of armed townsmen, unnamed but not forgotten, who chased it into the mine and sealed the entrance themselves. These men gave testimony in newspapers, in court records. Some even documented their experiences years later when reporters came asking. And they all told variations of the same story. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't a prank, and it wasn't a dream. It was something else, something real, and they were willing to stake their reputations on it. After 1903, the story slowly drifted into obscurity. Van Meter went back to being a quiet Iowa town. The mine was left alone. Children were warned to stay away from it, but few ever knew why. Then, in the early 2000s, a group of researchers rediscovered the original newspaper articles. They interviewed locals. They visited the old mine shaft. They combed through records and mapped out the events, night by night. Two authors in particular, Chad Lewis and Noah Voss, published a detailed investigation called The Van Meter Visitor, which reignited interest in the case across the paranormal community. They dug deep. They tracked down historical documents, even identified descendants of the original witnesses. And what they found was striking. The story had not changed. The details were still there, the glowing light, the wings, the footprints, the mine, and the town was ready to talk about it all over again. In 2013, on the 110th anniversary of the sightings, Van Meter hosted its first ever Van Meter Visitor Festival. What started as a small celebration of local lore quickly became something more. Cryptid researchers, folklorists, skeptics, and believers all gathered to share ideas. Locals shared family stories passed down from great-grandparents. Historical exhibits were created, lectures were given, books were sold. And suddenly, the Van Meter visitor was back. Not as a threat, but as a piece of living folklore, something that bound the town together and connected it to something bigger. Today, the festival draws hundreds. Vendors line the street with t-shirts and carved figurines. Speakers discussed winged cryptids and UFO sightings. Children dress up as mini visitors, running through town with glowing cardboard horns strapped to their heads. But there's also a reverence, because for many, this isn't just fun. It's a story they believe, a piece of history that never got its explanation. The mine is still sealed. No one knows what's behind the bricks, and few dare to disturb it. Some say the creatures left. Others say they're still down there, waiting. And yet, what makes the Van Meter visitor endure isn't the creature itself. It's the people who saw it, who stood by what they saw even when the world moved on. They didn't ask to be believed. They just told the truth, or at least what they believed to be the truth. And maybe that's enough, because what they left behind wasn't just a legend, it was a legacy. What happened in Van Meter, Iowa in 1903 didn't leave wreckage. It didn't leave injuries. It left questions. For 5 nights, something disturbed the rhythm of a quiet town. Something too big to explain, too strange to forget. There were no photos, no feathers, no bodies, just the smell, the fear, the silence that followed. And maybe that's why this story still matters, because not all legends come from violence. Some come from places where certainty fails. Maybe it was mass hysteria. Maybe it was something rare and real. Or maybe it was never about what they saw, but about what they couldn't unsee. The mine is still there, still sealed, still whispering to anyone curious enough to stand near its edge at dark. And the people of Van Meter, they remember, even now. This is State of the Unknown. Every other week, we travel to another corner of America, uncovering the haunted highways, hidden legends, and untold stories that refuse to stay buried. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, rate, and leave a review. And if you ever find yourself near the edge of Van Meter, don't knock on the bricks. Some doors are sealed for a reason.